Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So just a few minutes ago, the Retroid Pocket Mini arrived, and so today we're going to do just a quick impressions video with my first day with it. Now in general, it does take me a while to test these devices and really get a feel for how it's going to fit within the entire handheld ecosystem. But there are quite a few elements that I can figure out just from the get-go. You know, how does the screen look, how do the buttons feel, and how are the ergonomics? So that's what we're going to focus on here today. After that, give me a few days to really put it through its paces, and then we'll do a full-on review to let you know whether or not I think it's going to be worth its relatively high asking price of $200. At the very least, I am very excited about this one. I have been waiting forever to find that perfect small retro handheld where I can play all my classic systems and maybe something a little bit more modern as well. And even though we've had quite a few contenders over the years, we still haven't really found that one perfect device. And so that's what I'm shooting for, and that's what I'm hoping we will find with the Retroid Pocket Mini. Either way, let's go on that journey of discovery together. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, as we get started, I want to talk about what the Retroid Pocket Mini is and why it matters. In a nutshell, this is the 5th generation of Retroid Pocket devices. They started way back in 2019, and so now we've gotten one basically every year. And a few years ago, they started breaking off into two different lines of models. They had a smaller 4:3 aspect ratio device, and then a larger one as well, usually with a 16:9 aspect ratio screen. And so with this generation, the Retroid Pocket Mini is the 4:3 component. There is a Retroid Pocket 5, which is coming out in about a month. That one has that traditional 16:9 screen. Now traditionally, the 4:3 models like this one will usually have a lower quality chipset, and so they end up being a lot cheaper. And so when you think about the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus or the Retroid Pocket 2S, which was the previous one that they had, these usually come in at under $100. Now what makes the Retroid Pocket Mini unique is that it has the exact same chipset as the Retroid Pocket 5 coming out next month. They both have a Snapdragon 865 chipset. This is a little bit older of a chip, but it also is widely used. And this is great when it comes to emulation, because that means the compatibility with the most popular emulators will usually be really good. In addition to just the raw performance power, this one also has an OLED display like the Retroid Pocket 5. It just is 4:3 and a little bit smaller. This screen is 3.7 inches with a resolution of 1280 by 960 and an aspect ratio of 4:3. Now the drawback to having these really nice specs on a handheld means that the cost is higher, and so instead of being under $100 like the previous models, this one is selling for $199. So it is essentially just a mini version of the Retroid Pocket 5, which is only $20 more expensive than this one. And so number one, that's the big distinguishing factor about the Retroid Pocket Mini this time around. It is no longer the budget option. As of making this video, the Retroid Pocket 2S is still available on their website, so this is $99. So if you're looking into an entry-level handheld, then something like this is going to be half the price. And so at $199, I would no longer consider the Retroid Pocket Mini to be a budget device. At this point, we are looking at something that is kind of like the ultimate 4:3 handheld, and so that's the standard I'm holding it to. So not only does it need to be better than the Retroid Pocket 2S, but it should theoretically be twice as good because it is twice the price. And to be clear, I think that a $199 price point isn't necessarily a bad thing, just something to consider in that this is a higher quality and also higher priced device. And like I mentioned in the intro, I've always been on the hunt for a perfect 4:3 device, and I'm really hoping that this will get us even closer to that. So let's go ahead and jump into the unboxing, and as I look through the rest of the device, I will talk about some of its other specs as well. The box itself looks very similar to other Retroid products, and you can see that we have 5 different color options here. The one that I'll be unboxing is the Saturn model, but I personally have also bought the orange model, so I'm looking forward to testing that one out as well. I'd love to have seen a transparent model this time around, but unfortunately with a full glass front, that's not really something that's possible. But it is worth noting that on their website, Retroid is offering a variety of different transparent back plates. They've also got a couple other options like different colored buttons and whatnot, so you can really personalize the device if you're into that. Regardless, let's take a look inside of the box. And it looks like inside is basically your standard Retroid Pocket setup. Here we've got a quick user manual, which really just labels out all of the different buttons and then all of the specs that you can find on their website anyway. And it also comes with a USB-C to USB-A charging cable. Looking at the device itself, it is a beauty. This is the Saturn color, so it's got, obviously that Saturn controller kind of vibe to it. I'm personally a little bit more partial to like this Super Famicom-like color scheme, but honestly, this still looks pretty awesome. One of the things I've always wanted in a small handheld is the ability to play really good Sega Saturn, and with this chipset and an OLED display, this might be one of the best ways out there. And so in that regard, I'm super happy to have what appears to be like a little Sega Saturn. Now, of course, having 6 buttons would be even better, but I'll take what I can get. Now, first impressions just holding the device is that it is very lightweight and small. I don't know what it is, but the renders themselves made it look like it was going to be somewhat bigger than before, but honestly, I would still definitely say that this deserves the name Mini. In terms of pocketability, it is a handheld that I would not mind taking around in my pocket. Now, I'm obviously wearing shorts right now, and I'll have to test this with pants, but as it stands right now, yeah, this feels great. It is thicker because of these grips on the back, but they're not quite as prominent as you may think. If you look at it in a profile, you can see that they're basically all flush with the trigger buttons. And so if we look at something like the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, this one had these trigger buttons sticking out quite a bit and then it angled down. This is more like a Nintendo Switch style setup here. And so when it comes down to it, throwing either of these devices into your pocket is going to be a very similar experience. It just so happens that the bottom of the Retroid Pocket Mini also sticks out like the top. So overall, yes, it's definitely going to lead to a bulkier experience in your pocket, but I would still consider this to be a pocketable handheld. And again, we're talking about something that's powerful enough to play PlayStation 2, GameCube, Sega Saturn, all in your pocket, and I think that's amazing. Now, my second impression of the Retroid Pocket Mini is that it is a lot sleeker than you may expect from Retroid themselves. If we compare the 2S against the Retroid Pocket Mini, it almost feels like the 2S feels like a toy. It's just nice and boxy. It has a very 90s kind of aesthetic to it. And this is definitely not a bad thing. I've always loved just kind of the toy feel of a Retroid Pocket device. And a design like this evokes its own sort of nostalgia and charm, and so I've really enjoyed that. It almost feels like the Retroid Pocket Mini is its slightly bigger brother, who's also, gone to college and come back, and now he's got an MBA, and so he's a little bit more business. Meanwhile, the Retroid Pocket 2S, that guy dropped out of community college like me, and so, he's just a little bit more fun-loving. So I do see this as a bit of a transformation over to something that's a little bit more sleek and presentable. Whether or not you prefer one aesthetic over the other is going to be personal preference. The other thing that really punches up the quality and just overall look and feel of this device is the fact that it has a 100% glass front panel. You can see here when I move across the studio lights that yes, everything is reflective here on the front. It reminds me a lot of devices from another company called Neo, which makes a lot of really high-end boutique handhelds, and it also reminds me of the PS Vita, which the first 1000 series also had that same glass front. And so if you are looking for that very sleek experience, I think the Retroid Pocket Mini has it, and the Retroid Pocket 5 is also similarly designed. Now, one of the big questions I had about this device when I first ordered it was just how mini it was. How does it stack up against other handhelds? Let's do a quick comparison against others. Okay, to start, let's do the Retroid Pocket 2S. I think this is the most logical example. This one also has that 4:3 display and very similar components as well. The buttons feel similar, the D-pad as well. The screens are different between the two. This one is 3.7 inches, while this is 3.5. So it is a slight upgrade in space, but you can also tell just right off the bat that we have some pretty large bezels on the Mini. Now, from a technical standpoint, this is a bezel-less display. You can see there is no bezel along the front. And that's probably one of the reasons why they have that all-glass front, so that it just kind of fades away. But even allowing for that bezel-less display, you can still see it is quite chunky around the edges. And so the fact that we have so much handheld around the screen, I think takes away a little bit from the overall pleasing look. I do think if they were able to squeeze in a 4-inch display right here, it would really pop. But you also have to keep in mind that these manufacturers are just dealing with the screens that they have available within the market. None of these companies are big enough to be able to go to a manufacturer and say, can you make these specialized screens only for our device? That would drive up the cost super high. And so instead they are looking for off-the-shelf parts, including, cell phone screens and things like that. So my guess is they were not able to find an OLED display with this high of a resolution that was greater than 3.7 inches in size. So this is basically what we have to work with, and we'll dive more into the details of this screen and the resolution and size later on. But for now, at least you can see that yes, the Retroid Pocket 2S is slightly smaller than the Mini, but not by much. Now let's move on to the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. This one is quite a bit bigger. I'd say it's about an inch wider altogether. But of course, bear in mind, this is a 16:9 aspect ratio screen, so it is quite a bit wider, and you can also see that it does have black bezels. And so really, I think that the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is going to be a better comparison against the Retroid Pocket 5 when it releases, but I did want to show the size difference between the two, at least for now. Another handheld worth comparing against is going to be the Anbernic RG Cube. Now this one is not as powerful as the Retroid Pocket Mini. We'll do some benchmark comparisons here later, but they are very similar in some regards. They're both Android based, they have somewhat high resolution displays, and the price point is pretty similar as well. This one's like $180. You can also see that the RG Cube is quite a bit taller. That's because this is actually a square screen, so it's 1x1. But they are very similar handhelds when it comes to just the overall look and feel and the ergonomics, so they both have ergonomic bumps on them. The big difference is going to be that this one is just a little bit wider and shorter. Another high-end Android device worth comparing against is going to be this one, the AMOLED Pocket Micro. I just finished a review on this one a few days ago, and I think that these two in particular are really interesting to compare against. To start, the AMOLED Pocket Micro is a little bit wider of a display. This is a 3:2 aspect ratio, which makes it perfect for Game Boy Advance, and it turns out that it actually does really well with some 4:3 systems like Super Nintendo as well. In terms of width, they're about the same. I would say the Pocket Micro is just slightly smaller, but you can also see this one is quite a bit shorter as well, and it also doesn't have any ergonomic bumps to it. It is really just kind of a brick. So between the two, they're still mini devices, but the Micro is smaller. So next up, we have the AYN Odin 2 Mini. So this one is a smaller version of the original Odin 2. And the Odin 2 Mini is quite a bit more powerful than the Retroid Pocket Mini, but it also commands a higher price point. This one starts at over $300. The way I see it, the Odin 2 Mini is like a mini version of the high-end Android devices on the market, whereas the Retroid Pocket Mini is a high-end version of the mini devices on the market. So I think that each of them can justify their names, but for different reasons. And to give you an idea of the size difference, here's the original Odin 2 with its 6-inch display. Now let's say you're just now getting into retro handheld emulators, and so you don't really have anything to compare against, and you don't know what any of these other devices are. That's fine. Let's try something a little bit more corporate. So here we are with the original PlayStation Vita against the Retroid Pocket Mini, and you can see that, yeah, there's about a 1-inch difference between these as well. And the PS Vita is not something I would consider to be a mini device, but it's definitely more on the smaller side compared to other things that we have on the market. But at the very least, if you've ever had a PS Vita, then you'll at least know what you're getting into. Same thing with the PSP. This one's a little bit smaller. In fact, it's pretty close to the Retroid Pocket Mini. Now the battery is totally dead on this one, and so unfortunately I can't show you the screen size comparison, but this one was also a bezel-less display. And I think this is a good size to go for. The PSP, after all, is one of the most comfortable and beloved handhelds of all time, and so it's pretty awesome to be able to have something about the size of the PSP, but a lot more powerful. And then finally, here's a look between the Nintendo Switch Lite and the Retroid Pocket Mini. So there's probably about 1.5 inches, almost 2-inch difference between these. And so again, the Switch Lite is not something I would consider to be pocketable, but the Retroid Pocket Mini is. And of course, in case you are wondering, here is a comparison between the Retroid Pocket Mini and the Steam Deck. And you can see that, yeah, there's a big difference between the two. The Retroid Pocket Mini is the type of device that you can just grab with you and take around town or maybe on vacation, while taking the Steam Deck outside of the house feels more like a very deliberate decision. Okay, let's take a look at the controls. We'll start with the D-pad. Now this D-pad is very familiar if you've ever tried a Retroid device over the past few years. The D-pad here is very similar to what you would find on the original PS Vita, so it's got a bit of a clicky feel to it, and it just kind of pivots nicely as well. And when it comes to retro handhelds, I've always found this to be a very good D-pad. It's nice and small, but very precise. And it basically feels identical to the previous devices. So this is the Retroid Pocket 2S, and same style D-pad, although the design on the front is a little bit different. And in terms of just overall feel, it is a clicky D-pad as opposed to something that's like a rubber membrane. So it does have a more precise feeling compared to like an old Super Nintendo controller. Let's do a quick contra test. So here I'm going to press down on the D-pad, then rock it left and right, and you can see if I just rock it a little bit, the character doesn't move, but I can move it all the way to do a diagonal. And every time I push it far enough to hit that, I can actually feel it make a soft click. And so it is a very precise D-pad in that I know exactly what I'm pressing when I press it. And so while it may not give you a classic vibe, you know, it's not like an old Nintendo controller, it still feels very good and precise. Now when it comes to playing a Street Fighter game, somewhere where a diagonal is really important, it's a little bit harder for me. I really learned how to play Street Fighter with a rubber membrane D-pad, like a Super Nintendo controller. And so it does take me a while to warm up and get used to the clickiness of this D-pad altogether. But I would say this is not a bad thing, but rather just something that I need a couple days to adjust to. Long story short, when it comes to any of these types of games, I think the D-pad is an excellent fit once you acclimate to it. Now let's talk about these analog sticks, and these are also very similar to what we've seen in previous Retroid products. These are Hall sensor sticks, and they have a nice wide range of motion. The main thing that's new about these is the little rim right here is actually an RGB light. We'll test that out later. Now when it comes to actually testing this analog stick, I always use the same app, and yeah, we've got a full range of motion here. No cardinal snapping, I can go any direction I want to. It does snap to the center, much like other analog sticks, but that's just kind of how it's made to be. And so yes, I've got really precise inputs and a full range of motion. And if we play a game that relies on analog inputs like Super Monkey Ball, I'm pretty terrible at this game, but still I can feel that it's getting a true analog input, and so I think it feels pretty good, all things considered. I usually play Mario 64 to do this kind of testing, but I'm trying out a couple other options instead. Now these face buttons are rubber membrane, and so when I press on them, yes, it feels very much so like a classic button. Retroid buttons always have a bit of a clacky sound to them, and this is no different, so it is a little bit hollow feeling as you press down on it. But in general, the buttons are easy to press down on, and they do bounce up really quickly, and so I think in general these are good face buttons. Now we have multiple function buttons as well. Up here is our start button, then we have a back button for Android, and then up here we have select, and then down here we have a home button. We've also got two front-facing stereo speakers. Let's do a quick audio test with Streets Rage 2 at full volume. So overall, I would say the audio here is pretty good. It's very loud. I don't think I would ever have it at max volume. And the high end and the mid range are very prominent. I would say the high end more than anything. In terms of bassiness, as expected with a smaller handheld like this, it doesn't get super bassy, but that is basically par for the course for devices like this. And so in general, I would say that yeah, the sound is as expected and it is good enough. Now, one other thing worth noting just about the face in general is that this is obviously a D-pad centric device. This is very typical of Retroid. They put the D-pad up top most of the time. And I think between the two options, this is probably the correct setup because you're going to be playing a majority of retro and 4x3 content games, and most of those are going to benefit from having the D-pad in a more comfortable position. There are plenty of analog stick centric games that you can play on this, PlayStation 2, GameCube, so it does require a bit of a different grip to be able to use it, but because this is such a small device, I don't think it's that bad at all. And so I do like the fact that it has the D-pad up top. Now let's take a look at the top. We'll start with the shoulder and trigger buttons. Now the shoulder buttons are clicky but easy to press down on. They're a little bit loud but not too bad. If anything, I wish they were a little bit more dampened, like the little rubber that they're using right here over the micro switch was just a little bit stronger. But at the end of the day, I like the fact that it's easy to press down on, so no real complaints here. Now in terms of the triggers, these are analog, so you can press them down, and we only have a little bit of shallow travel, but I think this is enough, especially for a smaller device. I will say that the amount of resistance here to press it down is more than I expected, definitely more than the 2S. It's about the same as the Retroid Pocket 4 and 4 Pro, so I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily, but it does take a little bit of weight. I was also surprised to find that these buttons are not textured. They are on the 4 and 4 Pro, and so I was hoping that they would be here. I really like the look and feel of the grippy button, and so that's another thing I probably would have preferred. Also up top, we have our power button, volume up and down, and then our exhaust vent. Not a lot going on in the back, but we have our fan intake, so the air will come in here and then go out the top, and then we have an embossed Retroid Pocket logo. On the bottom, we have an SD card slot. I've already put my card inside, and I did find, like with other YouTubers, that this does not close all the way. It's hard to pick up here out of my camera, and it's very subtle, but yes, it does stick out just a tiny bit. Not a big deal. I don't think it's actually going to catch on anything, but I would prefer that it was just nice and flush, and so hopefully this is something they'll fix in the future. Also on the bottom, we've got a headphone jack and then our USB-C port. Of note, this is also DisplayPort out at 1080p. This means if you use a USB-C hub or dock or just a USB-C to HDMI adapter, you'll be able to plug this into a TV or a monitor. And we'll also test out this functionality in my final review. Other than that, there's nothing really surprising about this handheld. You know, the biggest thing is that I wanted to make sure that it was small and compact and comfortable, and I think it really does knock all of those out. I really do prefer having these small ergonomic bumps. It makes it a more comfortable handheld. It doesn't require you to buy an additional grip to make it more comfortable, and it also doesn't make the device stick out any more than it already did with the triggers, and so no complaints here when it comes to these grips on the back. In fact, I generally prefer a setup like this, where it's more rounded and then we have these ergonomic grips on the back. Yes, it doesn't make it as fun and cool looking as the Retroid Pocket 2S, but I think that I can hold this for a much longer period. Another thing worth noting is just the feel of pressing against glass and then a button. It is very premium feeling. And so as my thumb rests on the glass to press the button, I just really like that overall feel. In other words, the Retroid Pocket Mini feels like a $200 handheld. The Retroid Pocket 2S feels like something that's about $100. And I think both of these are good at their own price points, but I can see the difference between the two, at least just in terms of the overall look and feel. So now let's start up the device and talk about what it's like to actually use it from a software perspective. And it looks like the startup screen is very similar to what we've seen with other Retroid devices. So we will have a greeting, and then we can pick our language. We can also set up the internet. I'm going to skip that one for now, but then after that, you will be able to pick your time zone. And of course, we're going to go with Hawaii. And then after that, you'll also have the option of enabling Google Play services. You're going to want to have this on if you do plan on using the Google Play Store. In addition, they give you the option to pre-install a bunch of apps. And if you've ever watched any of my videos, I do recommend installing your own. And I've got entire Retroid Pocket startup guides that will apply to this device as well. So we're going to skip all these. From there, you're going to have the option of choosing between what they call the Retroid launcher as well as AOSP, or just a standard Android launcher. And this Retroid launcher is still a work in progress, so it's not available just yet, but it will be later. If you were to choose this right now, it would just give you the old launcher from the Retroid Pocket 4. As usual, we're just going to use the standard Android one, and then we'll set up our own front end later. And after that, we are now good to go. We've got just a standard blank Android device. And if you ever want to get into the front end launcher, it's going to be right there. Now, when it comes to any Retroid device, there's two things that are the most important. The first is understanding the top-down menu to be able to navigate through these controls. And the second will be the Retroid options, which we'll check out here in a moment. Now, in the top-down menu, we've got quite a few options. For example, we have different performance profiles. So you have the choice between standard, performance, and high performance depending on the type of game that you're playing. For example, if you're going to try to play a PS2 game and it's having a hard time in one of the bottom options, you can always put it into high performance. But bear in mind that will have an impact on your battery life. This is also the first Retroid device to release with RGB lighting around its analog sticks, and you can see the option is right here. If we tap on it, it'll turn on the light. Now if we go into the settings, we can change in what color we want, and we can also tone down the brightness by making it darker. And so for example here, very close to the bottom line, you can see it's a much more subtle color, so I'm going to stick with that. Now depending on the performance profile that you use, you can also have different fan settings. And so these will automatically set based on the performance profile, but you can always adjust them manually as well. And let's do a quick fan test while we're here to see how it sounds at the highest mode. So I would say the fan here is about the same as it was on the Retroid Pocket 4 and 4 Pro, so it's audible, but I wouldn't consider it to be loud. And if you are going to be playing a demanding game that requires a high performance mode, then yeah, it might be in your best interest to turn up the volume in your game just so you can hear it a little bit better. But in general, I would say the fan noise here is about what I would expect from a Retroid device, so no issues there. Now down here we have different control modes, so we can adjust, for example, whether or not we want it to be in what they call retro style. That means that it's going to be the A button on the right. Or you can also disconnect the controller if you were going to be hooking up to a Bluetooth controller. And then they also have what they call Xbox mode, which means that the A button is going to register here on the bottom. This is generally what I use for Android-based devices because many of them, especially Android games, are going to function with this bottom button as being A. Now to the right of that, we have the L2, R2 modes. So you can change this between being an analog input, a digital input, or just both at once. In general, I recommend using both because that's going to give you better compatibility. Now within the Android settings, you'll see there is an option called handheld settings near the bottom. This essentially will give you similar options that we saw in the top-down menu, but a couple extras as well. For example, under the Connect TV section, you can adjust what happens when you plug this into an external display. But you can see that some of these are also very similar. For example, the controller style is going to be the ability to change it between Xbox and Retro, and then L2, R2 mode, and so on. Next, I want to show some impressions with this screen. Now, this isn't going to be a full review. I think I need more time to really appreciate it, but I just have a couple first observations. Number one, I think that this display looks really good in terms of just the colors and the balance. I'm really impressed by it. After all, it is an OLED panel. Another thing worth noting is that it gets very bright and very dim. So here in just the Horizon Chase main world, you can see that we've got, a nice bright kind of background, but it might surprise you to see that we're somewhere between like 25 and 30% brightness. So this is actually very dim. Not only that, if we go all the way down, then the screen itself becomes almost invisible. Even with the studio lights off, you can barely see that anything is there. And so I think this will be a very good nighttime device. Now, in terms of max brightness, this is intense, way more than I would ever need indoors. But even outdoors, it's very impressive. Now, bear in mind, this is early evening, so I'm not getting any direct like noon sunlight on this device. But even then, when I try to get as many reflections to show up as possible, the screen is still super bright to the point where it kind of masks all those reflections. And so this is a device that I would easily be able to play outdoors as well. And it's not often that we get a screen that does both aspects so well. It gets very dim, it gets very bright, and the colors look very good. Among all the 4x3 devices I've ever tested, this is definitely the best and most impressive screen I've ever seen. Now, I think there are some complaints that can be made about the size of the overall bezel. I think it makes the device look just a little bit cheaper than it could be. If we look at this handheld as a comparison, this is the Anbernic RG40XXH. This one has a 4-inch display, and you can see that it is quite big. But on the other hand, you can also see the devices are almost identical in overall size. In fact, the Retroid Pocket Mini is just slightly wider. And so this is what I mean by the fact that I wish that a 4-inch screen was in the Retroid Pocket Mini. I think there's space for it. It would have to move the controls outboard a little bit, but I would really enjoy that. And like I said, it's probably because they had to make a decision. Go with OLED in 3.7 or go with a lower resolution 4-inch display like this one. And so I think in a perfect world, yes, I would have loved to have seen a 4-inch display on this device. I think it would have been really impressive. But when it comes to the other features, like an OLED panel and the fact that it gets very bright and dim, I can see why this screen has its own merits. I just wish it was a little bit bigger. Now let's talk about some of the benefits of this screen, given the fact that it is 1280 by 960. That is a high resolution for being only 3.7 inches. And I think the best example is going to be to show scaling with a 4x3 retro system like Super Nintendo. So here we are with Mega Man X. I've shown this a million times on my channel, and the idea here is that we want to make sure that we have balanced pixels when it comes to Mega Man's life bar. And if you look here, it's not a perfect balance, and that's because this is not a true integer scale. Now, if we go into the RetroArch settings, we turn on integer scale, you can see that yes, it does make the screen a little bit smaller. So if you wanted to have integer scaling, you definitely could. It will give you very minor black bars on the left and right, but I think that's perfectly acceptable if you want to make sure you have true integer scaling. Now, if you want to make sure that you have a full screen and you also want to have balanced pixels, then I would recommend using an interpolation shader. And I just recently did a full guide talking about shaders and overlays, and I'll leave it linked down below. But for this example, we're going to use this one. It's called Pixel AA. This is a very sharp interpolation shader. And so now with that preset active, you can actually see that we are getting balanced pixels right here, and it is also full screen. So long story short, if you just set up that one shader, you will have something that's basically indistinguishable from integer scaling. And that's one of those benefits of having a high resolution display. Everything looks nice and crisp. Now, when it comes to other systems like Game Boy and Game Boy Color, these are also not perfectly integer scaled. So you've got a couple options here. For example, you could use non-integer scaling like this. This is going to be a 6.7 scale. And because these original screens were pretty low resolution, you may not see any sort of imbalance anyway. So long story short, when you have a high resolution screen like this, playing low resolution systems gives you more flexibility. Now, it's very similar with Game Boy Advance as well. This will have some black borders at the top and bottom because it is a wider display than 4x3. And this is not going to be perfectly integer scaled either. This is somewhere around like 5.3 scale. So again, it's very close to being perfect, and you could always mask that with an interpolation shader, but I just like it as it is. And so I definitely consider this to be a system where you could play Game Boy Advance and really enjoy it as well. Now, another added benefit of having this screen resolution is that it's a perfect 2x integer scale with 480p screens. So if you take a typical screen like Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, Sega Saturn, PS1, all of those are going to scale up really nicely. And so this means that you end up with a really nicely scaled, clean image, all things considered. Okay, before we move into the performance-minded systems, let's talk a little bit about performance in general. And just doing a quick benchmark here with 3D Mark Wildlife, you can see I got 4675. And for context, here are the scores with other devices. So the Retroid Pocket 2S gets 528. So we are getting very close to 10 times the performance on the Retroid Pocket Mini compared to the RP2S. And so if you remember earlier, I said that, the device needs to be at least twice as good as the RP2S because it's twice the price. You can see that performance-wise, it's like 8 times better. Now, on the other hand, a very similar device is the RG Cube. This one's about $20 cheaper, but you can see it's less than half the performance. And also bear in mind, this is just synthetic benchmarks, and so you may see some differences when it comes to actual gameplay. Either way, when it comes to raw performance power, you can see that the Retroid Pocket Mini has it in spades. But also bear in mind, there is still room to grow. For example, with the Odin 2 Mini, this one is so powerful that it actually maxes out the specs. Now, I'll do a lot more testing and give a final assessment in my review video, but for now, I want to at least show you some of the discoveries I've made over the first couple hours. And so now let's take a look at some of the harder to run systems and some examples there. Now, I've only had a couple hours with the device, but I have set up my emulators and also the emulation station front end. This theme game is called Canvas, and I like it because I can navigate through my various systems. Let's start with Nintendo 64 and one of the hardest games to play. So I'm running this at a perfect resolution scale for this screen, so 1280 by 960. And this game is running absolutely fine, no problem whatsoever. In fact, if I turn on fast forward, you can see that the frames per second actually jumps up to somewhere around 400. So we have a ton of headroom when it comes to playing this system, to the point where we can play this at a 2x upscale with no problem whatsoever. And that makes sense because even the Retroid Pocket 2S did great with a Nintendo 64, and this is no different. And it's the exact same results when it comes to Sega Dreamcast, so I can play everything at a 2x scale or 960p, and yeah, everything looks great, and man, these colors really pop on the OLED display as well. So if you are looking to play some of these classic 3D games in a 4:3 aspect ratio with a little bit of upscaling, yeah, this is definitely going to fit that bill. Now let's push it a little bit more. We're going to use Sega Saturn this time as our example. Now I'm going to use the Beetle Core, which is a much more accurate emulator, but is also harder to use. But even though it is very performance requiring, you can see that yeah, it's playing at full speed with absolutely no problem on one of the hardest games available on the Sega Saturn. So I do think this will be an excellent Sega Saturn machine. You'll be able to use a very accurate core and still have excellent gameplay. Now when it comes to the really difficult games to play like Last Bronx, you can see that it's not getting a full frame rate. I'm only getting 52 frames per second. But also bear in mind that I'm only using the standard mode, so we haven't even gone to performance mode at this point. But if we bump it up to the high performance mode, it is playing at full speed, but it is also kicking on that fan, which can get kind of loud. So this is one of those times where you would probably want to turn up the volume. But yeah, it is going to play every game that I've tested on Sega Saturn at full speed, but maybe with the higher performance mode. And honestly, most of the games that I tried with Sega Saturn play just fine without having to increase the performance mode. So it's really going to be those very hard to play games like Last Bronx. You can see here Die Hard Arcade is playing just fine at the regular standard mode. Now when it comes to PSP, the biggest drawback here is not the performance at all. In fact, we can play this at a 3x resolution with absolutely no issue. The big drawback here is going to be playing 16:9 content on a 4:3 display. You can see we have some pretty big black bars at the top and bottom. And when you combine that with a relatively small 3.7-inch size, this just doesn't make it a very good experience altogether. You can see just how much smaller this screen is compared to the original PSP, so it is a bit of a downgrade when it comes to size. But when it comes to performance, there will be absolutely no issue here. You can play everything at a 3x resolution upscale, and everything will play at full speed. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about GameCube emulation using the Dolphin emulator. A couple things worth noting that are special about this emulator and this chipset is that if we go into the graphics settings under GPU driver, we can load our own standard GPU drivers. And so if you want to experiment with like turnip drivers, you can definitely do that. I've messed around with a few on Dolphin and I haven't really seen a big performance difference, at least on this device. So in this testing, we are going to just keep it with the regular system driver because I haven't seen any improvement with the turnip ones. One thing to keep in mind is that a 2x upscale is going to be perfect for this screen. It's 1280 by 1056, which is going to fill out all the pixels that we have. And so there really is no benefit to bump it up to a 3x native scale. It's just overkill at that point with this screen. Now, if you were to plug this into an external display, then I could see you trying to push it that far, but for now, we're just going to test it at the native 2x resolution. Okay, so let's start with a harder to run game. This is Beyond Good and Evil, and I'm playing this at a 2x scale with the high performance mode turned on. I'm getting a couple dips down below 60 frames per second, but not much. I would say this is perfectly playable as it is. And this is a game that's very hard to emulate, even in this beginning scene, and you can see that, yeah, it's playing great. Here's another game that's kind of harder to play. This is Medal of Honor Rising Sun, and it's playing really well. This is in high performance mode, but still getting full speed. Here's one more example. This is Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2, and this one is also playing very close to full speed. Every once in a while I get some slowdown, like right there, it just went down to 58. But for the most part, even at a 2x resolution scale, yeah, it's playing well. The lowest I've seen it go is 55 frames per second, and so unless you're a real stickler to make sure this game plays perfectly, I think this is going to be pretty good here. And then finally, let's test out PlayStation 2. Again, we're going to focus on the harder to run systems. So here is Burnout Revenge, playing at a 2x scale, and yeah, it's playing at full speed. I did have to adjust it over to the Vulkan backend from OpenGL, but after that, yeah, everything's playing nicely. And this is definitely one of the harder to play games on PS2, definitely in the top 10%, so this is a really good sign. Here's another example with Ratchet & Clank Up Your Arsenal and also 2x upscale, and it's playing great. And so for me, this is a good indication that your 3D style platformers like Ratchet & Clank are going to play just fine. And one more example here. Here's God of War 2, again at a 2x upscale with the high performance mode, and absolutely no problem whatsoever. So I didn't have to adjust anything within the settings, it's just playing. And it is pretty crazy to have such a small little handheld like this be able to play PS2 very comfortably. And so for now, that's the extent of my testing. I'll do a bunch more before my final review to give you an idea of what exactly this can and cannot play. So now that we've gone through and tested all the performance, let's kind of wrap up and talk about my feelings when it comes to the Retroid Pocket Mini. And I plan on doing a full breakdown in the final review to kind of talk about, all the good and the bad and whether or not it's worth it. But for now, let's just kind of talk about some of my takeaways when it comes to these early impressions. Jumping into this device, my number one concern was whether or not it justified the increase in price. Because for all intents and purposes, Retroid has now doubled the price of their smaller handheld. And the most important thing for me was not necessarily whether or not Retroid was going to maintain that $100 price point, but really it was whether or not they could justify charging $200 for a similar device. And I think there's a couple reasons why this actually works out pretty well. The first, obviously, is that it feels like a more premium product. Some of that has to do with the OLED display, the other part has to do with that nice glass front. And I also think that this device is an excellent example of all the incremental updates that Retroid has made over the years. Because at this point, these controls are all locked in, and I think they're really great. The other part that was important to me was that the performance matched the price increase as well. And just looking at synthetic benchmarks, I think you can see that they are there. We're looking at something that's about 8 times more powerful. And just in my preliminary testing, it can play all of the PS2 and GameCube games that I tried at a 2x upscale, which is perfect for this screen. And so my initial impressions here are that Retroid did pull this off. Essentially, we're looking at a mini version of the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, which originally released for $250. So this is a handheld that's better suited for 4x3 content, is $50 cheaper, and has an OLED display. And I think when you stack those all together, the excellent performance and excellent overall feel, then yes, I think it justifies that $200 price point. But of course, I need a little bit more time before I can say anything definitively, so be on the lookout for a final review coming here very soon. And also let me know in the comments below specific games you want me to test or other factors that are important to you as well. As for me, I'm really looking forward to testing this machine for the next few days because it is quickly becoming one of my favorites. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.